Chapter 20 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 20 is a chapter of love. "Pecksniff," said Jonas, taking off his hat to see that the black crape band was all right, and finding that it was, putting it on again complacently, "what do you mean to give your daughters when they marry?" "My dear Mr. Jonas," cried the affectionate parent, with an ingenuous smile, "what a very singular inquiry!" "Now don't you mind whether it's a singular inquiry or a plural one," retorted Jonas, eyeing Mr. Pecksniff with no great favour, "but answer it or let it alone, one or the other." The question, my dear friend," said Mr. Pecksniff, laying his hand tenderly upon his kinsman's knee, "is involved with many considerations. What would I give them? Eh?" "Ah, what would you give 'em?" repeated Jonas. "Why, that," said Mr. Pecksniff, "would naturally depend in a great measure upon the kind of husbands they might choose, my dear young friend." Mr. Jonas was evidently disconcerted, and at a loss how to proceed. It was a good answer. It seemed a deep one, but such is the wisdom of simplicity. "My standard for the merits I would require in a son-in-law," said Mr. Pecksniff after a short silence, "is a high one. Forgive me, my dear Mr. Jonas," he added, greatly moved, "if I say that you have spoiled me and made it a fanciful one, an imaginative one, a prismatically tinged one, if I may be permitted to call it so." "What do you mean by that?" growled Jonas, looking at him with increased disfavour. "Indeed, my dear friend," said Mr. Pecksniff, "you may well inquire. The heart is not always a royal mint, with patent machinery to work its metal into current coin. Sometimes it throws it out in strange forms, not easily recognized as coin at all. But it is sterling gold. It has at least that merit. It is sterling gold." "Is it?" grumbled Jonas, with a doubtful shake of the head. "Aye," said Mr. Pecksniff, warming with his subject, "it is. To be plain with you, Mr. Jonas, if I could find two such sons-in-law as you will one day make to some deserving man, capable of appreciating a nature such as yours, I would, forgetful of myself, bestow upon my daughters portions reaching to the very utmost limit of my means." This was strong language, and it was earnestly delivered. But who can wonder that such a man as Mr. Pecksniff, after all he had seen and heard of Mr. Jonas, should be strong and earnest upon such a theme that touched even the worldly lips of undertakers with the honey of eloquence? Mr. Jonas was silent, and looked thoughtfully at the landscape, for they were seated on the outside of the coach, at the back, and were travelling down into the country. He accompanied Mr. Pecksniff home for a few days' change of air and scene after his recent trials. "Well," he said at last, with captivating bluntness, "suppose you got one such son-in-law as me, what then?" Mr. Pecksniff regarded him at first with inexpressible surprise, then, gradually breaking into a sort of dejected vivacity, said, "Then well I know whose husband he would be." "Whose?" asked Jonas dryly. "My eldest girl's, Mr. Jonas," replied Pecksniff, with moistening eyes. "My dear Cherry's. My staff, my scrip, my treasure, Mr. Jonas. A hard struggle, but it is in the nature of things. I must one day part with her to a husband. I know it, my dear friend. I am prepared for it." "Ecod, you've been prepared for that a pretty long time, I should think," said Jonas. "Many have sought to bear her from me," said Mr. Pecksniff. "All have failed. 'I never will give my hand, papa,' those were her words, 'unless my heart is won.' She has not been quite so happy as she used to be of late. I don't know why." Again Mr. Jonas looked at the landscape, then at the coachman, then at the luggage on the roof, finally at Mr. Pecksniff. "I suppose you'll have to part with the other one some of these days," he observed, as he caught that gentleman's eye. "Probably," said the parent. "Years will tame down the wildness of my foolish bird, and then it will be caged. But Cherry, Mr. Jonas, Cherry—" "Oh, ah!" interrupted Jonas, "years have made her all right enough. Nobody doubts that. But you haven't answered what I asked you. Of course you're not obliged to do it, you know, if you don't like. You're the best judge." There was a warning sulkiness in the manner of this speech which admonished Mr. Pecksniff that his dear friend was not to be trifled with or fenced off, and that he must either return a straightforward reply to his question, or plainly give him to understand that he declined to enlighten him upon the subject to which it referred. Mindful in this dilemma of the caution old Anthony had given him almost with his latest breath, he resolved to speak to the point, and so told Mr. Jonas, enlarging upon the communication as a proof of his great attachment and confidence, that in the case he had put, to wit, in the event of such a man as he proposing for his daughter's hand, he would endow her with a fortune of £4,000. "I should sadly pinch and cramp myself to do so," was his fatherly remark, "but that would be my duty, and my conscience would reward me. For myself, my conscience is my bank. I have a trifle invested there, a mere trifle, Mr. Jonas, but I prize it as a store of value, I assure you." The good man's enemies would have divided upon this question into two parties. One would have asserted without scruple that if Mr. Pecksniff's conscience were his bank, and he kept a running account there, he must have overdrawn it beyond all mortal means of computation. The other would have contended that it was a mere fictitious form, a perfectly blank book, or one in which entries were only made with a peculiar kind of invisible ink to become legible at some indefinite time, and that he never troubled it at all. "It would sadly pinch and cramp me, my dear friend," repeated Mr. Pecksniff, "but Providence, perhaps I may be permitted to say a special Providence, has blessed my endeavours, and I could guarantee to make the sacrifice." A question of philosophy arises here, whether Mr. Pecksniff had or had not good reason to say that he was specially patronized and encouraged in his undertakings. All his life long he had been walking up and down the narrow ways and by-places, with a hook in one hand and a crook in the other, scraping all sorts of valuable odds and ends into his pouch. Now, there being a special providence in the fall of a sparrow, it follows, so Mr. Pecksniff and only such admirable men would have reasoned, that there must also be a special providence in the alighting of the stone or stick or other substance which is aimed at the sparrow. And Mr. Pecksniff's hook or crook having invariably knocked the sparrow on the head and brought him down, that gentleman may have been led to consider himself as specially licensed to bag sparrows, and as being specially seized and possessed of all the birds he had got together. That many undertakings, national as well as individual, but especially the former, are held to be specially brought to a glorious and successful issue, which never could be so regarded on any other process of reasoning, must be clear to all men. Therefore the precedents would seem to show that Mr. Pecksniff had, as things go, good argument for what he said, and might be permitted to say it, and did not say it presumptuously, vainly, or arrogantly, but in a spirit of high faith and great wisdom. Mr. Jonas, not being much accustomed to perplex his mind with theories of this nature, expressed no opinion on the subject, nor did he receive his companion's announcement with one solitary syllable, good, bad, or indifferent. He preserved this taciturnity for a quarter of an hour at least, and during the whole of that time appeared to be steadily engaged in subjecting some given amount to the operation of every known rule in figures, adding to it, taking from it, multiplying it, reducing it by long and short division, working it by the rule of three, direct and inversed, exchange or barter, practice, simple interest, compound interest, and other means of arithmetical calculation. The result of these labours appeared to be satisfactory, for when he did break silence, it was as one who had arrived at some specific result and freed himself from a state of distressing uncertainty. "Come, old Pecksniff," such was his jocose address, as he slapped that gentleman on the back at the end of the stage, "let's have something." "With all my heart," said Mr. Pecksniff. "Let's treat the driver," cried Jonas. "If you think it won't hurt the man, or render him discontented with his station, certainly," faltered Mr. Pecksniff. Jonas only laughed at this, and getting down from the coach top with great alacrity, cut a cumbersome kind of caper in the road. After which he went into the public house, and there ordered spirituous drink to such an extent that Mr. Pecksniff had some doubts of his perfect sanity, until Jonas set them quite at rest by saying, when the coach could wait no longer, "I've been standing treat for a whole week and more, and letting you have all the delicacies of the season. You shall pay for this, Pecksniff." It was not a joke either, as Mr. Pecksniff at first supposed, for he went off to the coach without further ceremony, and left his respected victim to settle the bill. But Mr. Pecksniff was a man of meek endurance, and Mr. Jonas was his friend. Moreover, his regard for that gentleman was founded, as we know, on pure esteem, and a knowledge of the excellence of his character. He came out from the tavern with a smiling face, and even went so far as to repeat the performance, on a less expensive scale, at the next alehouse. There was a certain wildness in the spirits of Mr. Jonas, not usually a part of his character, which was far from being subdued by these means, and for the rest of the journey he was so very buoyant, it may be said boisterous, that Mr. Pecksniff had some difficulty in keeping pace with him. They were not expected. Oh dear, no. Mr. Pecksniff had proposed in London to give the girls a surprise, and had said he wouldn't write a word to prepare them on any account, in order that he and Mr. Jonas might take them unawares, and just see what they were doing when they thought their dear papa was miles and miles away. As a consequence of this playful device, there was nobody to meet them at the finger post. But that was of small consequence, for they had come down by the day coach, and Mr. Pecksniff had only a carpet bag, while Mr. Jonas had only a portmanteau. They took the portmanteau between them, put the bag upon it, and walked off up the lane without delay, Mr. Pecksniff already going on tiptoe, as if, without this precaution, his fawn children, being then at a distance of a couple of miles or so, would have some filial sense of his approach. It was a lovely evening in the springtime of the year, and in the soft stillness of the twilight all nature was very calm and beautiful. The day had been fine and warm, but at the coming on of night the air grew cool, and in the mellowing distance smoke was rising gently from the cottage chimneys. There were 1,000 pleasant scents diffused around, from young leaves and fresh buds. The cuckoo had been singing all day long, and was but just now hushed. The smell of earth newly upturned, first breath of hope to the first labourer after his garden withered, was fragrant in the evening breeze. It was a time when most men cherish good resolves, and sorrow for the wasted past; when most men, looking on the shadows as they gather, think of that evening which must close on all, and that to-morrow which has none beyond. "Precious dull," said Mr. Jonas, looking about. "It's enough to make a man go melancholy mad." "We shall have lights in the fire soon," observed Mr. Pecksniff. "We shall need 'em by the time we get there," said Jonas. "Why the devil don't you talk? What are you thinking of?" "To tell you the truth, Mr. Jonas," said Pecksniff with great solemnity, "my mind was running at that moment on our late dear friend, your departed father." Mr. Jonas immediately let his burden fall, and said, threatening him with his hand, "Drop that, Pecksniff." Mr. Pecksniff, not exactly knowing whether allusion was made to the subject or the portmanteau, stared at his friend in unaffected surprise. "Drop it, I say!" cried Jonas fiercely. "Do you hear? Drop it, now and for ever. You had better, I give you notice." "It was quite a mistake," urged Mr. Pecksniff, very much dismayed. "Though I admit it was foolish. I might have known it was a tender string." "Don't talk to me about tender strings," said Jonas, wiping his forehead with the cuff of his coat. "I'm not going to be crowed over by you because I don't like dead company." Mr. Pecksniff had got out the words, "Crowed over, Mr. Jonas," when that young man with a dark expression in his countenance cut him short once more. "Mind," he said, "I won't have it. I advise you not to revive the subject, neither to me nor anybody else. You can take a hint, if you choose, as well as another man. There's enough said about it. Come along." Taking up his part of the load again when he had said these words, he hurried on so fast that Mr. Pecksniff, at the other end of the portmanteau, found himself dragged forward in a very inconvenient and ungraceful manner, to the great detriment of what is called by fancy gentlemen the bark upon his shins, which were most unmercifully bumped against the hard leather and the iron buckles. In the course of a few minutes, however, Mr. Jonas relaxed his speed, and suffered his companion to come up with him and to bring the portmanteau into a tolerably straight position. It was pretty clear that he regretted his late outbreak, and that he mistrusted its effect on Mr. Pecksniff, for as often as that gentleman glanced towards Mr. Jonas, he found Mr. Jonas glancing at him, which was a new source of embarrassment. It was but a short-lived one, though, for Mr. Jonas soon began to whistle, whereupon Mr. Pecksniff, taking his cue from his friend, began to hum a tune melodiously. "Pretty nearly there, ain't we?" said Jonas, when this had lasted some time. "Close, my dear friend," said Mr. Pecksniff. "What'll they be doing, do you suppose?" asked Jonas. "Impossible to say," cried Mr. Pecksniff. "Giddy truants! They may be away from home, perhaps. I was going to propose," said Mr. Pecksniff, "that we should enter by the back way and come upon them like a clap of thunder, Mr. Jonas." It might not have been easy to decide in respect of which of their manifold properties, Jonas, Mr. Pecksniff, the carpet bag, and the portmanteau, could be likened to a clap of thunder; but Mr. Jonas giving his assent to this proposal, they stole round into the back yard and softly advanced towards the kitchen window, through which the mingled light of fire and candle shone upon the darkening night. Truly Mr. Pecksniff is blessed in his children, in one of them at any rate. The prudent Cherry, staff and scrip and treasure of her doting father, there she sits at a little table, white as driven snow, before the kitchen fire, making up accounts. See the neat maiden, as with pen in hand and calculating look addressed towards the ceiling, and bunch of keys within a little basket at her side, she checks the housekeeping expenditure. From flat iron, dish cover, and warming pan, from pot and kettle, face of brass footman, and black leaded stove, bright glances of approbation wink and glow upon her. The very onions dangling from the beam mantle and shine like cherubs' cheeks. Something of the influence of those vegetables sinks into Mr. Pecksniff's nature. He weeps. It is but for a moment, and he hides it from the observation of his friend, very carefully, by a somewhat elaborate use of his pocket-handkerchief, in fact, for he would not have his weakness known. "Pleasant," he murmured, "pleasant to a father's feelings. My dear girl! Shall we let her know we are here, Mr. Jonas?" "Why, I suppose you don't mean to spend the evening in the stable or the coach house?" he returned. "That, indeed, is not such hospitality as I would show to you, my friend," cried Mr. Pecksniff, pressing his hand. And then he took a long breath, and tapping at the window, shouted with stentorian blandness, "Bo!" Cherry dropped her pen and screamed, but innocence is ever bold, or should be. As they opened the door, the valiant girl exclaimed in a firm voice, and with a presence of mind which even in that trying moment did not desert her, "Who are you? What do you want? Speak, or I will call my pa." Mr. Pecksniff held out his arms. She knew him instantly, and rushed into his fond embrace. "It was thoughtless of us, Mr. Jonas, it was very thoughtless," said Pecksniff, smoothing his daughter's hair. "My darling, do you see that I am not alone?" Not she. She had seen nothing but her father until now. She saw Mr. Jonas now, though, and blushed, and hung her head down as she gave him welcome. But where was Mary? Mr. Pecksniff didn't ask the question in reproach, but in a vein of mildness touched with a gentle sorrow. She was upstairs, reading on the parlour couch. Ah, domestic details had no charms for her. "But call her down," said Mr. Pecksniff, with a placid resignation. "Call her down, my love." She was called, and came, all flushed and tumbled from reposing on the sofa, but none the worse for that. No, not at all. Rather the better, if anything. "Oh, my goodness me!" cried the arch girl, turning to her cousin when she had kissed her father on both cheeks, and in her frolicsome nature had bestowed a supernumerary salute upon the tip of his nose. "You here, fright! Well, I'm very thankful that you won't trouble me much." "What, you're as lively as ever, are you?" said Jonas. "Oh, you're a wicked one." "There, go along," retorted Mary, pushing him away. "I'm sure I don't know what I shall ever do if I have to see much of you. Go along, for gracious sake." Mr. Pecksniff striking in here, with a request that Mr. Jonas would immediately walk upstairs, he so far complied with the young lady's adjuration as to go at once. But though he had the fair Cherry on his arm, he could not help looking back at her sister, and exchanging some further dialogue of the same bantering description, as they all four ascended to the parlour, where, for the young ladies happened, by good fortune, to be a little later than usual that night, the tea-board was at that moment being set out. Mr. Pinch was not at home, so they had it all to themselves, and were very snug and talkative, Jonas sitting between the two sisters, and displaying his gallantry in that engaging manner which was peculiar to him. It was a hard thing, Mr. Pecksniff said, when tea was done and cleared away, to leave so pleasant a little party, but having some important papers to examine in his own apartment, he must beg them to excuse him for half an hour. With this apology he withdrew, singing a careless strain as he went. He had not been gone 5 minutes when Mary, who had been sitting in the window, apart from Jonas and her sister, burst into a half-smothered laugh and skipped towards the door. "Hello!" cried Jonas. "Don't go." "Oh, I dare say," rejoined Mary, looking back. "You're very anxious I should stay, fright, ain't you?" "Yes, I am," said Jonas. "Upon my word I am. I want to speak to you." But as she left the room notwithstanding, he ran out after her, and brought her back, after a short struggle in the passage, which scandalized Miss Cherry very much. "Upon my word, Mary," urged that young lady, "I wonder at you. There are bounds even to absurdity, my dear." "Thank you, my sweet," said Mary, pursing up her rosy lips. "Much obliged to it for its advice. Oh, do leave me alone, you monster, do!" This entreaty was wrung from her by a new proceeding on the part of Mr. Jonas, who pulled her down, all breathless as she was, into a seat beside him on the sofa, having at the same time Miss Cherry upon the other side. "Now," said Jonas, clasping the waist of each, "I have got both arms full, haven't I?" "One of them will be black and blue to-morrow if you don't let me go," cried the playful Mary. "Ah, I don't mind your pinching," grinned Jonas, "a bit." "Pinch him for me, Cherry, pray," said Mercy. "I never did hate anybody so much as I hate this creature, I declare." "No, no, don't say that," urged Jonas. "And don't pinch, either, because I want to be serious. I say, Cousin Charity." "Well, what?" she answered sharply. "I want to have some sober talk," said Jonas. "I want to prevent any mistakes, you know, and to put everything upon a pleasant understanding. That's desirable and proper, ain't it?" Neither of the sisters spoke a word. Mr. Jonas paused and cleared his throat, which was very dry. "She'll not believe what I am going to say, will she, cousin?" said Jonas, timidly squeezing Miss Charity. "Really, Mr. Jonas, I don't know until I hear what it is. It's quite impossible." "Why, you see," said Jonas, "her way always being to make game of people, I know she'll laugh, or pretend to. I know that beforehand. But you can tell her I'm in earnest, cousin, can't you? You'll confess, you know, won't you? You'll be honorable, I'm sure," he added persuasively. No answer. His throat seemed to grow hotter and hotter, and to be more and more difficult of control. "You see, Cousin Charity," said Jonas, "nobody but you can tell her what pains I took to get into her company when you were both at the boarding house in the city, because nobody's so well aware of it, you know. Nobody else can tell her how hard I tried to get to know you better, in order that I might get to know her without seeming to wish it, can they? I always asked you about her, and said where had she gone, and when would she come, and how lively she was, and all that. Didn't I, cousin? I know you'll tell her so, if you haven't told her so already. And I dare say you have, because I'm sure you're honorable, ain't you?" Still not a word. The right arm of Mr. Jonas, the elder sister sat upon his right, may have been sensible of some tumultuous throbbing which was not within itself, but nothing else surprised him that his words had had the least effect. "Even if you kept it to yourself and haven't told her," resumed Jonas, "it don't much matter, because you'll bear honest witness now, won't you? We've been very good friends from the first, haven't we? And of course we shall be quite friends in future, and so I don't mind speaking before you a bit. Cousin Mercy, you've heard what I've been saying. She'll confirm it, every word. She must. Will you have me for your husband, eh?" As he released his hold of Charity to put this question with better effect, she started up and hurried away to her own room, marking her progress as she went by such a train of passionate and incoherent sound as nothing but a slighted woman in her anger could produce. "Let me go away. Let me go after her," said Mary, pushing him off, and giving him, to tell the truth, more than one sounding slap upon his outstretched face. "Not till you say yes. You haven't told me. Will you have me for your husband?" "No, I won't. I can't bear the sight of you. I have told you so 100 times. You are a fright. Besides, I always thought you liked my sister best. We all thought so." "But that wasn't my fault," said Jonas. "Yes, it was. You know it was." "Any trick is fair in love," said Jonas. "She may have thought I liked her best, but you didn't." "I did." "No, you didn't. You never could have thought I liked her best when you were by." "There's no accounting for tastes," said Mary. "At least I didn't mean to say that. I don't know what I mean. Let me go to her." "Say yes, and then I will." "If I ever brought myself to say so, it should only be that I might hate and tease you all my life." "That's as good," cried Jonas, "as saying it right out. It's a bargain, cousin. We're a pair if ever there was one." This gallant speech was succeeded by a confused noise of kissing and slapping, and then the fair but much dishevelled Mary broke away and followed in the footsteps of her sister. Now whether Mr. Pecksniff had been listening, which in one of his character appears impossible, or divined, almost by inspiration, what the matter was, which in a man of his sagacity is far more probable, or happened by sheer good fortune to find himself in exactly the right place at precisely the right time, which, under the special guardianship in which he lived, might very reasonably happen, it is quite certain that at the moment when the sisters came together in their own room he appeared at the chamber door. And a marvellous contrast it was, they so heated, noisy, and vehement, he so calm, so self-possessed, so cool and full of peace, that not a hair upon his head was stirred. "Children!" said Mr. Pecksniff, spreading out his hands in wonder, but not before he had shut the door and set his back against it. "Girls! Daughters! What is this?" "The wretch, the apostate, the false, mean, odious villain, has before my very face proposed to Mercy," was his eldest daughter's answer. "Who has proposed to Mercy?" asked Mr. Pecksniff. "He has. That thing Jonas downstairs." "Jonas proposed to Mercy?" said Mr. Pecksniff. "Aye, aye, indeed." "Have you nothing else to say?" cried Charity. "Am I to be driven mad, papa? He has proposed to Mercy, not to me." "Oh, fie, for shame!" said Mr. Pecksniff gravely. "Oh, for shame! Can the triumph of a sister move you to this terrible display, my child? Oh, really, this is very sad. I am sorry, I am surprised and hurt to see you so. Mercy, my girl, bless you. See to her. Ah, envy, envy, what a passion you are!" Uttering this apostrophe in a tone full of grief and lamentation, Mr. Pecksniff left the room, taking care to shut the door behind him, and walked downstairs into the parlour. There he found his intended son-in-law, whom he seized by both hands. "Jonas!" cried Mr. Pecksniff. "Jonas, the dearest wish of my heart is now fulfilled." "Very well, I'm glad to hear it," said Jonas. "That'll do, I say. As it ain't the one you're so fond of, you must come down with another 1,000, Pecksniff. You must make it up 5. It's worth that to keep your treasure to yourself, you know. You get off very cheap that way, and haven't a sacrifice to make." The grin with which he accompanied this set off his other attractions to such unspeakable advantage that even Mr. Pecksniff lost his presence of mind for a moment, and looked at the young man as if he were quite stupefied with wonder and admiration. But he quickly regained his composure, and was in the very act of changing the subject, when a hasty step was heard without, and Tom Pinch, in a state of great excitement, came darting into the room. On seeing a stranger there, apparently engaged with Mr. Pecksniff in private conversation, Tom was very much abashed, though he still looked as if he had something of great importance to communicate, which would be a sufficient apology for his intrusion. "Mr. Pinch," said Pecksniff, "this is hardly decent. You will excuse my saying that I think your conduct scarcely decent, Mr. Pinch." "I beg your pardon, sir," replied Tom, "for not knocking at the door." "Rather beg this gentleman's pardon, Mr. Pinch," said Pecksniff. "I know you. He does not." "My young man, Mr. Jonas." The son-in-law that was to be gave him a slight nod, not actively disdainful or contemptuous, only passively, for he was in a good humour. "Could I speak a word with you, sir, if you please?" said Tom. "It's rather pressing." "It should be very pressing to justify this strange behavior, Mr. Pinch," returned his master. "Excuse me for one moment, my dear friend. Now, sir, what is the reason of this rough intrusion?" "I am very sorry, sir, I am sure," said Tom, standing, cap in hand, before his patron in the passage. "And I know it must have a very rude appearance." "It has a very rude appearance, Mr. Pinch." "Yes, I feel that, sir. But the truth is, I was so surprised to see them, and knew you would be too, that I ran home very fast indeed, and really hadn't enough command over myself to know what I was doing very well. I was in the church just now, sir, touching the organ for my own amusement, when I happened to look round, and saw a gentleman and lady standing in the aisle listening. They seemed to be strangers, sir, as well as I could make out in the dusk, and I thought I didn't know them. So presently I left off, and said would they walk up into the organ loft or take a seat. No, they said they wouldn't do that, but they thanked me for the music they had heard." "In fact," observed Tom, blushing, "they said 'delicious music.' At least she did, and I am sure that was a greater pleasure and honor to me than any compliment I could have had. I beg your pardon, sir." He was all in a tremble, and dropped his hat for the second time. "But I'm rather flurried, and I fear I've wandered from the point." "If you will come back to it, Thomas," said Mr. Pecksniff, with an icy look, "I shall feel obliged." "Yes, sir," returned Tom, "certainly. They had a posting carriage at the porch, sir, and had stopped to hear the organ, they said. And then they said, she said, I mean, 'I believe you live with Mr. Pecksniff, sir?' I said I had that honor, and I took the liberty, sir," added Tom, raising his eyes to his benefactor's face, "of saying, as I always will and must, with your permission, that I was under great obligations to you, and never could express my sense of them sufficiently." "That," said Mr. Pecksniff, "was very, very wrong. Take your time, Mr. Pinch." "Thank you, sir," cried Tom. "On that they asked me, she asked, I mean, wasn't there a bridle road to Mr. Pecksniff's house?" Mr. Pecksniff suddenly became full of interest. "Without going by the Dragon?" "When I said there was, and said how happy I should be to show it 'em, they sent the carriage on by the road and came with me across the meadows. I left 'em at the turnstile to run forward and tell you they were coming, and they'll be here, sir, in less than a minute's time, I should say," added Tom, fetching his breath with difficulty. "Now who," said Mr. Pecksniff, pondering, "who may these people be?" "Bless my soul, sir," cried Tom, "I meant to mention that at first. I thought I had. I knew them, her, I mean, directly. The gentleman who was ill at the Dragon, sir, last winter, and the young lady who attended him." Tom's teeth chattered in his head, and he positively staggered with amazement at witnessing the extraordinary effect produced on Mr. Pecksniff by these simple words. The dread of losing the old man's favour almost as soon as they were reconciled, through the mere fact of having Jonas in the house, the impossibility of dismissing Jonas, or shutting him up, or tying him hand and foot and putting him in the coal cellar, without offending him beyond recall, the horrible discordance prevailing in the establishment, and the impossibility of reducing it to decent harmony with Cherry in loud hysterics, Mercy in the utmost disorder, Jonas in the parlour, and Martin Chuzzlewit and his young charge upon the very doorsteps. The total hopelessness of being able to disguise or feasibly explain this state of rampant confusion, the sudden accumulation over his devoted head of every complicated perplexity and entanglement for his extrication from which he had trusted to time, good fortune, chance, and his own plotting, so filled the entrapped architect with dismay, that if Tom could have been a Gorgon staring at Mr. Pecksniff, and Mr. Pecksniff could have been a Gorgon staring at Tom, they could not have horrified each other half so much as in their own bewildered persons. "Dear, dear!" cried Tom, "what have I done? I hoped it would be a pleasant surprise, sir. I thought you would like to know." But at that moment a loud knocking was heard at the hall door. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 21. More American Experiences. Martin takes a partner and makes a purchase. Some account of Eden as it appeared on paper. Also of the British Lion. Also of the kind of sympathy professed and entertained by the Watertoast Association of United Sympathizers. Part 1. The knocking at Mr. Pecksniff's door, though loud enough, bore no resemblance whatever to the noise of an American railway train at full speed. It may be well to begin the present chapter with this frank admission, lest the reader should imagine that the sounds now deafening this history's ears have any connection with the knocker on Mr. Pecksniff's door, or with the great amount of agitation pretty equally divided between that worthy man and Mr. Pinch, of which its strong performance was the cause. Mr. Pecksniff's house is more than 1,000 leagues away, and again this happy chronicle has liberty and moral sensibility for its high companions. Again it breathes the blessed air of independence. Again it contemplates with pious awe that moral sense which renders unto Caesar nothing that is his. Again inhales that sacred atmosphere which was the life of him, O noble patriot with many followers, who dreamed of freedom in a slave's embrace, and waking sold her offspring and his own in public markets. How the wheels clank and rattle and the tramroad shakes as the train rushes on, and now the engine yells, as it were lashed and tortured like a living laborer, and writhed in agony. A poor fancy, for steel and iron are of infinitely greater account in this commonwealth than flesh and blood. If the cunning work of man be urged beyond its power of endurance, it has within it the elements of its own revenge, whereas the wretched mechanism of the divine hand is dangerous with no such property, but may be tampered with, and crushed and broken at the driver's pleasure. Look at that engine. It shall cost a man more dollars in the way of penalty and fine, and satisfaction of the outraged law, to deface in wantonness that senseless mass of metal, than to take the lives of 20 human creatures. Thus the stars wink upon the bloody stripes, and liberty pulls down her cap upon her eyes, and owns oppression in its vilest aspect for her sister. The engine driver of the train whose noise awoke us to the present chapter was certainly troubled with no such reflections as these. Nor is it very probable that his mind was disturbed by any reflections at all. He leaned with folded arms and crossed legs against the side of the carriage, smoking, and, except when he expressed, by a grunt as short as his pipe, his approval of some particularly dexterous aim on the part of his colleague, the fireman, who beguiled his leisure by throwing logs of wood from the tender at the numerous stray cattle on the line, he preserved a composure so immovable, and an indifference so complete, that if the locomotive had been a sucking pig, he could not have been more perfectly indifferent to its doings. Notwithstanding the tranquil state of this officer and his unbroken peace of mind, the train was proceeding with tolerable rapidity, and the rails being but poorly laid, the jolts and bumps it met with in its progress were neither slight nor few. There were 3 great caravans or cars attached: the ladies' car, the gentlemen's car, and the car for negroes, the latter painted black, as an appropriate compliment to its company. Martin and Mark Tapley were in the first, as it was the most comfortable, and being far from full received other gentlemen, who, like them, were unblessed by the society of ladies of their own. They were seated side by side, and were engaged in earnest conversation. "And so, Mark," said Martin, looking at him with an anxious expression, "and so you are glad we have left New York far behind us, are you?" "Yes, sir," said Mark, "I am precious glad." "Were you not jolly there?" asked Martin. "On the contrary, sir," returned Mark, "the jolliest week as ever I spent in my life was that there week at Pawkins's." "What do you think of our prospects?" inquired Martin, with an air that plainly said he had avoided the question for some time. "Uncommon bright, sir," returned Mark. Impossible for a place to have a better name, sir, than the Walley of Eden. No man couldn't think of settling in a better place than the Walley of Eden. And I'm told," added Mark after a pause, "as there's lots of serpents there. So we shall come out quite complete and reg'lar." So far from dwelling upon this agreeable piece of information with the least dismay, Mark's face grew radiant as he called it to mind, so very radiant that a stranger might have supposed he had all his life been yearning for the society of serpents, and now hailed with delight the approaching consummation of his fondest wishes. "Who told you that?" asked Martin sternly. "A military officer," said Mark. "Confound you for a ridiculous fellow!" cried Martin, laughing heartily in spite of himself. "What military officer? You know they spring up in every field." "As thick as scarecrows in England, sir," interposed Mark, "which is a sort of militia themselves, being entirely coat and waistcoat with a stick inside. Ha, ha! Don't mind me, sir. It's my way sometimes. I can't help being jolly. Why, it was one of them invading conquerors at Pawkins's as told me. 'Am I rightly informed,' he says, not exactly through his nose, but as if he'd got a stoppage in it very high up, 'that you're a going to the Walley of Eden?' I heard some talk on it, I told him. 'Oh,' says he, 'if you should ever happen to go to bed there, you may, you know,' he says, 'in course of time, as civilization progresses, don't forget to take a axe with you.' I looks at him tolerable hard. 'Fleas?' says I. 'And more,' says he. 'Wampires?' says I. 'And more,' says he. 'Mosquitoes, perhaps?' says I. 'And more,' says he. 'What more?' says I. 'Snakes more,' says he. 'Rattlesnakes. You're right to a certain extent, stranger. There air some catawampus chawers in the small way, too, as graze upon a human pretty strong. But don't mind them. They're company. It's snakes,' he says, 'as you'll object to. And whenever you wake and see one in a upright posture on your bed,' he says, 'like a corkscrew with the handle off, a sittin' on its bottom ring, cut him down, for he means wenom.'" "Why didn't you tell me this before?" cried Martin, with an expression of face which set off the cheerfulness of Mark's visage to great advantage. "I never thought on it, sir," said Mark. "It come in at one ear and went out at the other. But Lord love us, he was one of another company, I dare say, and only made up the story that we might go to his Eden, and not the opposition one." "There's some probability in that," observed Martin. "I can honestly say that I hope so, with all my heart." "I've not a doubt about it, sir," returned Mark, who, full of the inspiriting influence of the anecdote upon himself, had for the moment forgotten its probable effect upon his master. "Anyhow, we must live, you know, sir." "Live!" cried Martin. "Yes, it's easy to say live, but if we should happen not to wake when rattlesnakes are making corkscrews of themselves upon our beds, it may be not so easy to do it." "And that's a fact," said a voice so close in his ear that it tickled him. "That's dreadful true." Martin looked round, and found that a gentleman on the seat behind had thrust his head between himself and Mark, and sat with his chin resting on the back rail of their little bench, entertaining himself with their conversation. He was as languid and listless in his looks as most of the gentlemen they had seen. His cheeks were so hollow that he seemed to be always sucking them in, and the sun had burnt him, not a wholesome red or brown, but dirty yellow. He had bright dark eyes, which he kept half closed, only peeping out of the corners, and even then with a glance that seemed to say, "Now you won't overreach me. You want to, but you won't." His arms rested carelessly on his knees as he leant forward. In the palm of his left hand, as English rustics have their slice of cheese, he had a cake of tobacco; in his right a penknife. He struck into the dialogue with as little reserve as if he had been specially called in days before to hear the arguments on both sides, and favour them with his opinion; and he no more contemplated or cared for the possibility of their not desiring the honour of his acquaintance or interference in their private affairs, than if he had been a bear or a buffalo. "That," he repeated, nodding condescendingly to Martin, as to an outer barbarian and foreigner, "is dreadful true. Darn all manner of vermin." Martin could not help frowning for a moment, as if he were disposed to insinuate that the gentleman had unconsciously darned himself; but remembering the wisdom of doing at Rome as Romans do, he smiled with the pleasantest expression he could assume upon so short a notice. Their new friend said no more just then, being busily employed in cutting a quid or plug from his cake of tobacco, and whistling softly to himself the while. When he had shaped it to his liking, he took out his old plug, and deposited the same on the back of the seat between Mark and Martin, while he thrust the new one into the hollow of his cheek, where it looked like a large walnut or tolerable pippin. Finding it quite satisfactory, he stuck the point of his knife into the old plug, and, holding it out for their inspection, remarked, with the air of a man who had not lived in vain, that it was used up considerable. Then he tossed it away, put his knife into one pocket and his tobacco into another, rested his chin upon the rail as before, and, approving of the pattern on Martin's waistcoat, reached out his hand to feel the texture of that garment. "What do you call this now?" he asked. "Upon my word," said Martin, "I don't know what it's called." "It'll cost $1 or more a yard, I reckon." "I really don't know." "In my country," said the gentleman, "we know the cost of our own produce." Martin not discussing the question, there was a pause. "Well," resumed their new friend, after staring at them intently during the whole interval of silence, "how's the unnatural old parent by this time?" Mr. Tapley, regarding this inquiry as only another version of the impertinent English question, "How's your mother?" would have resented it instantly but for Martin's prompt interposition. "You mean the old country?" he said. "Ah," was the reply. "How's she? Progressing backwards, I expect, as usual. Well, how's Queen Victoria?" "In good health, I believe," said Martin. "Queen Victoria won't shake in her royal shoes at all when she hears to-morrow named," observed the stranger. "No." "Not that I am aware of. Why should she?" "She won't be taken with a cold chill when she realizes what is being done in these diggings," said the stranger. "No." "No," said Martin. "I think I could take my oath of that." The strange gentleman looked at him as if in pity for his ignorance or prejudice, and said: "Well, sir, I tell you this. There ain't a engine with its biler bust in God A'mighty's free United States so fixed and nipped and frizzled to a most etarnal smash as that young critter, and her luxurious location in the Tower of London will be when she reads the next double extra Watertoast Gazette." Several other gentlemen had left their seats and gathered round during the foregoing dialogue. They were highly delighted with this speech. One very lank gentleman, in a loose, limp white cravat, long white waistcoat, and a black greatcoat, who seemed to be an authority among them, felt called upon to acknowledge it. "Hem! Mr. Lafayette Kettle," he said, taking off his hat. There was a grave murmur of "Hush!" "Mr. Lafayette Kettle, sir." Mr. Kettle bowed. "In the name of this company, sir, and in the name of our common country, and in the name of that righteous cause of holy sympathy in which we are engaged, I thank you. I thank you, sir, in the name of the Watertoast sympathizers, and I thank you, sir, in the name of the Watertoast Gazette, and I thank you, sir, in the name of the Star-Spangled Banner of the great United States, for your eloquent and categorical exposition. And if, sir," said the speaker, poking Martin with the handle of his umbrella to bespeak his attention, for he was listening to a whisper from Mark, "if, sir, in such a place and at such a time, I might venture to conclude with a sentiment glancing, however slantindicularly, at the subject in hand, I would say, sir, may the British lion have his talons eradicated by the noble bill of the American eagle, and be taught to play upon the Irish harp and the Scotch fiddle that music which is breathed in every empty shell that lies upon the shores of green Columbia." Here the lank gentleman sat down again amidst a great sensation, and every one looked very grave. "General Choke," said Mr. Lafayette Kettle, "you warm my heart, sir. You warm my heart. But the British lion is not unrepresented here, sir, and I should be glad to hear his answer to those remarks." "Upon my word," cried Martin, laughing, "since you do me the honour to consider me his representative, I have only to say that I never heard of Queen Victoria reading the What's his name Gazette, and that I should scarcely think it probable." General Choke smiled upon the rest, and said, in patient and benignant explanation, "It is sent to her, sir. It is sent to her. Her mail." "But if it is addressed to the Tower of London, it would hardly come to hand, I fear," returned Martin, "for she don't live there." "The Queen of England, gentlemen," observed Mr. Tapley, affecting the greatest politeness, and regarding them with an immovable face, "usually lives in the Mint, to take care of the money. She has lodgings, in virtue of her office, with the Lord Mayor at the Mansion House, but don't often occupy them, in consequence of the parlour chimney smoking." "Mark," said Martin, "I shall be very much obliged to you if you'll have the goodness not to interfere with preposterous statements, however jocose they may appear to you. I was merely remarking, gentlemen, though it's a point of very little import, that the Queen of England does not happen to live in the Tower of London." "General," cried Mr. Lafayette Kettle, "you hear?" "General," echoed several others. "General!" "Hush, pray, silence!" said General Choke, holding up his hand, and speaking with a patient and complacent benevolence that was quite touching. "I have always remarked it as a very extraordinary circumstance, which I impute to the nature of British institutions and their tendency to suppress that popular inquiry and information which are so widely diffused, even in the trackless forests of this vast continent of the Western Ocean, that the knowledge of Britishers themselves on such points is not to be compared with that possessed by our intelligent and locomotive citizens. This is interesting, and confirms my observation. When you say, sir," he continued, addressing Martin, "that your Queen does not reside in the Tower of London, you fall into an error, not uncommon to your countrymen, even when their abilities and moral elements are such as to command respect. But, sir, you err wrong. She does live there." "When she is at the court of St. James's," interposed Kettle. "When she is at the court of St. James's, of course," returned the general in the same benignant way, "for if her location was in Windsor Pavilion, it couldn't be in London at the same time. Your Tower of London, sir," pursued the general, smiling with a mild consciousness of his knowledge, "is naturally your royal residence. Being located in the immediate neighbourhood of your parks, your drives, your triumphant arches, your opera, and your royal almacks, it naturally suggests itself as the place for holding a luxurious and thoughtless court. And consequently," said the general, "consequently the court is held there." "Have you been in England?" asked Martin. "In print I have, sir," said the general, "not otherwise. We are a reading people here, sir. You will meet with much information among us that will surprise you, sir." "I have not the least doubt of it," returned Martin. But here he was interrupted by Mr. Lafayette Kettle, who whispered in his ear, "You know General Choke?" "No," returned Martin in the same tone. "You know what he is considered?" "One of the most remarkable men in the country?" said Martin at a venture. "That's a fact," rejoined Kettle. "I was sure you must have heard of him." "I think," said Martin, addressing himself to the general again, "that I have the pleasure of being the bearer of a letter of introduction to you, sir, from Mr. Bevan of Massachusetts," he added, giving it to him. The general took it and read it attentively, now and then stopping to glance at the two strangers. When he had finished the note he came over to Martin, sat down by him, and shook hands. "Well," he said, "and you think of settling in Eden?" "Subject to your opinion and the agent's advice," replied Martin. "I am told there is nothing to be done in the old towns." "I can introduce you to the agent, sir," said the general. "I know him. In fact, I am a member of the Eden Land Corporation myself." This was serious news to Martin, for his friend had laid great stress upon the general's having no connection, as he thought, with any land company, and therefore being likely to give him disinterested advice. The general explained that he had joined the corporation only a few weeks ago, and that no communication had passed between himself and Mr. Bevan since. "We have very little to venture," said Martin anxiously. "Only a few pounds, but it is our all. Now do you think that for one of my profession this would be a speculation with any hope or chance in it?" "Well, observed the general gravely. "If there wasn't any hope or chance in the speculation, it wouldn't have engaged my dollars, I opinionate." "I don't mean for the sellers," said Martin. "For the buyers, for the buyers." "For the buyers, sir," observed the general in a most impressive manner. "Well, you come from an old country, from a country, sir, that has piled up golden calves as high as Babel, and worshipped 'em for ages. We are a new country, sir. Man is in a more primeval state here, sir. We have not the excuse of having lapsed in the slow course of time into degenerate practices. We have no false gods. Man, sir, here is man in all his dignity. We fought for that or nothing. Here am I, sir," said the general, setting up his umbrella to represent himself, and a villainous looking umbrella it was, a very bad counter to stand for the sterling coin of his benevolence. "Here am I with grey hairs, sir, and a moral sense. Would I, with my principles, invest capital in this speculation if I didn't think it full of hopes and chances for my brother man?" Martin tried to look convinced, but he thought of New York and found it difficult. "What are the great United States for, sir," pursued the general, "if not for the regeneration of man? But it is natural in you to make such an enquiry, for you come from England, and you do not know my country." "Then you think," said Martin, "that, allowing for the hardships we are prepared to undergo, there is a reasonable, heaven knows we don't expect much, a reasonable opening in this place?" "A reasonable opening in Eden, sir? But see the agent, see the agent. See the maps and plans, sir, and conclude to go or stay according to the natur of the settlement. Eden hadn't need to go a begging yet, sir," remarked the general. "It is an awful lovely place, sure ly, and frightful wholesome likewise," said Mr. Kettle, who had made himself a party to this conversation as a matter of course. Martin felt that to dispute such testimony, for no better reason than because he had his secret misgivings on the subject, would be ungentlemanly and indecent. So he thanked the general for his promise to put him in personal communication with the agent, and concluded to see that officer next morning. He then begged the general to inform him who the Watertoast sympathizers were of whom he had spoken in addressing Mr. Lafayette Kettle, and on what grievances they bestowed their sympathy. To which the general, looking very serious, made answer that he might fully enlighten himself on those points to morrow by attending a great meeting of the body, which would then be held at the town to which they were travelling, "over which, sir," said the general, "my fellow citizens have called on me to preside." They came to their journey's end late in the evening. Close to the railway was an immense white edifice, like an ugly hospital, on which was painted "National Hotel." There was a wooden gallery, or veranda, in front, in which it was rather startling, when the train stopped, to behold a great many pairs of boots and shoes, and the smoke of a great many cigars, but no other evidences of human habitation. By slow degrees, however, some heads and shoulders appeared, and connecting themselves with the boots and shoes, led to the discovery that certain gentlemen boarders, who had a fancy for putting their heels where the gentlemen boarders in other countries usually put their heads, were enjoying themselves after their own manner in the cool of the evening. There was a great bar room in this hotel, and a great public room in which the general table was being set out for supper. There were interminable whitewashed staircases, long whitewashed galleries upstairs and downstairs, scores of little whitewashed bedrooms, and a four-sided veranda to every story in the house, which formed a large brick square with an uncomfortable courtyard in the centre, where some clothes were drying. Here and there some yawning gentlemen lounged up and down with their hands in their pockets; but within the house and without, wherever half a dozen people were collected together, there, in their looks, dress, morals, manners, habits, intellect, and conversation, were Mr. Jefferson Brick, Colonel Diver, Major Pawkins, General Choke, and Mr. Lafayette Kettle, over and over and over again. They did the same things, said the same things, judged all subjects by, and reduced all subjects to, the same standard. Observing how they lived, and how they were always in the enchanting company of each other, Martin even began to comprehend their being the social, cheerful, winning, airy men they were. At the sounding of a dismal gong, this pleasant company went trooping down from all parts of the house to the public room, while from the neighbouring stores other guests came flocking in shoals; for half the town, married folks as well as single, resided at the National Hotel. Tea, coffee, dried meats, tongue, ham, pickles, cake, toast, preserves, and bread and butter were swallowed with the usual ravaging speed, and then, as before, the company dropped off by degrees and lounged away to the desk, the counter, or the bar-room. The ladies had a smaller ordinary of their own, to which their husbands and brothers were admitted if they chose, and in all other respects they enjoyed themselves as at Pawkins's. "Now mark, my good fellow," said Martin, closing the door of his little chamber, "we must hold a solemn council, for our fate is decided to morrow morning. You are determined to invest these savings of yours in the common stock, are you?" "If I hadn't been determined to make that wenter, sir," answered Mr. Tapley, "I shouldn't have come." "How much is there here, did you say?" asked Martin, holding up a little bag. £37 10 6. The Savings Bank said so, at least. I never counted it, but they know, bless you," said Mark, with a shake of the head, expressive of his unbounded confidence in the wisdom and arithmetic of those institutions. "The money we brought with us," said Martin, "is reduced to a few shillings less than £8." Mr. Tapley smiled and looked all manner of ways, that he might not be supposed to attach any importance to this fact. "Upon the ring, her ring, Mark," said Martin, looking ruefully at his empty finger. "Ah," sighed Mr. Tapley, "beg your pardon, sir. We raised in English money £14, so even with that your share of the stock is still very much the larger of the two, you see. Now, Mark," said Martin in his old way, just as he might have spoken to Tom Pinch, "I have thought of a means of making this up to you, more than making it up to you, I hope, and very materially elevating your prospects in life." "Oh, don't talk of that, you know, sir," returned Mark. "I don't want no elevating, sir. I'm all right enough, sir, I am." "No, but hear me," said Martin, "because this is very important to you, and a great satisfaction to me. Mark, you shall be a partner in the business, an equal partner with myself. I will put in, as my additional capital, my professional knowledge and ability, and half the annual profits, as long as it is carried on, shall be yours." End of Chapter 21, Part 1. Chapter 21, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 21, Part 2. Poor Martin! Forever building castles in the air! Forever, in his very selfishness, forgetful of all but his own teeming hopes and sanguine plans! Swelling at that instant with the consciousness of patronizing and most munificently rewarding Mark. "I don't know, sir," Mark rejoined, much more sadly than his custom was, though from a very different cause than Martin supposed, "what I can say to this, in the way of thanking you. I'll stand by you, sir, to the best of my ability, and to the last. That's all." "We quite understand each other, my good fellow," said Martin, rising in self-approval and condescension. "We are no longer master and servant, but friends and partners, and are mutually gratified. If we determine on Eden, the business shall be commenced as soon as we get there. Under the name," said Martin, who never hammered upon an idea that wasn't red hot, "under the name of Chuzzlewit and Tapley." "Lord love you, sir," cried Mark, "don't have my name in it. I ain't acquainted with the business, sir. I must be co. I must. I've often thought," he added in a low voice, "as I should like to know a co. But I little thought as ever I should live to be one." "You shall have your own way, Mark." "Thank'ee, sir. If any country gentleman thereabouts, in the public way or otherwise, wanted such a thing as a skittle ground made, I could take that part of the business, sir." "Against any architect in the States," said Martin. "Get a couple of sherry cobblers, Mark, and we'll drink success to the firm." Either he forgot already, and often afterwards, that they were no longer master and servant, or considered this kind of duty to be among the legitimate functions of the co. But Mark obeyed with his usual alacrity, and before they parted for the night, it was agreed between them that they should go together to the agent's in the morning, but that Martin should decide the Eden question on his own sound judgment. And Mark made no merit, even to himself in his jollity, of this concession, perfectly well knowing that the matter would come to that in the end anyway. The General was one of the party at the public table next day, and after breakfast suggested that they should wait upon the agent without loss of time. They, desiring nothing more, agreed, so off they all four started for the office of the Eden Settlement, which was almost within rifle shot of the National Hotel. It was a small place, something like a turnpike, but a great deal of land may be got into a dice box. And why may not a whole territory be bargained for in a shed? It was but a temporary office, too, for the Edeners were going to build a superb establishment for the transaction of their business, and had already got so far as to mark out the site, which is a great way in America. The office door was wide open, and in the doorway was the agent. No doubt a tremendous fellow to get through his work, for he seemed to have no arrears, but was swinging backwards and forwards in a rocking chair, with one of his legs planted high up against the doorpost, and the other doubled up under him as if he were hatching his foot. He was a gaunt man in a huge straw hat and a coat of green stuff. The weather being hot, he had no cravat, and wore his shirt collar wide open, so that every time he spoke something was seen to twitch and jerk up in his throat, like the little hammers in a harpsichord when the notes are struck. Perhaps it was the truth feebly endeavoring to leap to his lips. If so, it never reached them. Two gray eyes lurked deep within this agent's head, but one of them had no sight in it and stood stock still. With that side of his face he seemed to listen to what the other side was doing. Thus each profile had a distinct expression, and when the movable side was most in action, the rigid one was in its coldest state of watchfulness. It was like turning the man inside out, to pass to that view of his features in his liveliest mood, and see how calculating and intent they were. Each long black hair upon his head hung down as straight as any plummet line, but rumpled tufts were on the arches of his eyes, as if the crow whose foot was deeply printed in the corners had pecked and torn them in a savage recognition of his kindred nature as a bird of prey. Such was the man whom they now approached, and whom the General saluted by the name of Scatter. "Well, General," he returned, "and how are you?" "Active and spry, sir, in my country's service and the sympathetic cause. Two gentlemen on business, Mr. Scatter." He shook hands with each of them (nothing is done in America without shaking hands), then went on rocking. "I think I know what business you have brought these strangers here upon, then, General." "Well, sir, I expect you may." "You air a tonguey person, General, for you talk too much, and that's fact," said Scatter. "You speak alarming well in public, but you didn't ought to go ahead so fast in private. Now." "If I can realize your meaning, ride me on a rail," returned the General, after pausing for consideration. "You know we didn't wish to sell the lots off right away to any loafer as might bid," said Scatter, "but had concluded to reserve 'em for aristocrats of nater. Yes." "And they are here, sir," cried the General with warmth. "They are here, sir." "If they air here," returned the agent in reproachful accents, "that's enough. But you didn't ought to have your dander riz with me, General." The General whispered Martin that Scatter was the honestest fellow in the world, and that he wouldn't have given him offence designedly for $10,000. "I do my duty, and I raise the dander of my fellow critters as I wish to serve," said Scatter in a low voice, looking down the road and rocking still. "They rile up rough along of my objecting to their selling Eden off too cheap. That's human nater. Well, Mr. Scatter," said the General, assuming his oratorical deportment, "sir, here is my hand, and here my heart. I esteem you, sir, and ask your pardon. These gentlemen air friends of mine, or I would not have brought 'em here, sir, being well aware, sir, that the lots at present go entirely too cheap. But these air friends, sir, these air partickler friends." Mr. Scadder was so satisfied by this explanation that he shook the General warmly by the hand and got out of the rocking chair to do it. He then invited the General's particular friends to accompany him into the office. As to the General, he observed, with his usual benevolence, that being one of the company he wouldn't interfere in the transaction on any account. So he appropriated the rocking chair to himself and looked at the prospect, like a good Samaritan waiting for a traveller. "Heyday!" cried Martin, as his eye rested on a great plan which occupied one whole side of the office. Indeed, the office had little else in it but some geological and botanical specimens, one or two rusty ledgers, a homely desk, and a stool. "Heyday! What's that?" "That's Eden," said Scadder, picking his teeth with a sort of young bayonet that flew out of his knife when he touched a spring. "Why, I had no idea it was a city." "Hadn't you? Oh, it's a city." "A flourishing city, too. An architectural city. There were banks, churches, cathedrals, market-places, factories, hotels, stores, mansions, wharves, an exchange, a theatre, public buildings of all kinds, down to the office of the Eden Stinger, a daily journal, all faithfully depicted in the view before them." "Dear me, it's really a most important place," cried Martin, turning round. "Oh, it's very important," observed the agent. "But I am afraid," said Martin, glancing again at the public buildings, "that there's nothing left for me to do." "Well, it ain't all built," replied the agent. "Not quite." This was a great relief. "The market-place, now," said Martin. "Is that built?" "That?" said the agent, sticking his toothpick into the weathercock on the top. "Let me see. No, that ain't built." "Rather a good job to begin with, eh, Mark?" whispered Martin, nudging him with his elbow. Mark, who with a very stolid countenance had been eyeing the plan and the agent by turns, merely rejoined, "Uncommon." A dead silence ensued. Mr. Scadder, in some short recesses or vacations of his toothpick, whistled a few bars of Yankee Doodle and blew the dust off the roof of the theatre. "I suppose," said Martin, feigning to look more narrowly at the plan, but showing by his tremulous voice how much depended, in his mind, upon the answer, "I suppose there are several architects there." "There ain't a single one," said Scadder. "Mark," whispered Martin, pulling him by the sleeve, "do you hear that?" "But whose work is all this before us, then?" he asked aloud. "The soil being very fruitful, public buildings grows spontaneous, perhaps," said Mark. He was on the agent's dark side as he said it, but Scadder instantly changed his place and brought his active eye to bear upon him. "Feel of my hands, young man," he said. "What for?" asked Mark, declining. "Air they dirty or air they clean, sir?" said Scadder, holding them out. In a physical point of view they were decidedly dirty. But it being obvious that Mr. Scadder offered them for examination in a figurative sense, as emblems of his moral character, Martin hastened to pronounce them pure as the driven snow. "I entreat, Mark," he said with some irritation, "that you will not obtrude remarks of that nature, which, however harmless and well intentioned, are quite out of place, and cannot be expected to be very agreeable to strangers. I am quite surprised." "The co's a putting his foot in it already," thought Mark. "He must be a sleeping partner. Fast asleep and snoring, co must, I see." Mr. Scadder said nothing, but he set his back against the plan and thrust his toothpick into the desk some 20 times, looking at Mark all the while as if he were stabbing him in effigy. "You haven't said whose work it is?" Martin ventured to observe at length, in a tone of mild propitiation. "Well, never mind whose work it is or isn't," said the agent sulkily. "No matter how it did eventuate. P'raps he cleared off handsome with a heap of dollars. P'raps he wasn't worth a cent. P'raps he was a loafin' rowdy. P'raps a ring-tailed roarer. Now—" "All your doing, Mark," said Martin. "P'raps," pursued the agent, "them ain't plants of Eden's raising. No. P'raps that desk and stool ain't made from Eden lumber. No. P'raps no end of squatters ain't gone out there. No. P'raps there ain't no such location in the territory of the great United States. Oh, no." "I hope you are satisfied with the success of your joke, Mark," said Martin. But here, at a most opportune and happy time, the General interposed, and called out to Scatter from the doorway to give his friends the particulars of that little lot of 50 acres with the house upon it, which, having belonged to the company formerly, had lately lapsed again into their hands. "You air a deal too open handed, General," was the answer. "It is a lot as should be rose in price, it is." He grumblingly opened his books notwithstanding, and always keeping his bright side towards Mark, no matter at what amount of inconvenience to himself, displayed a certain leaf for their perusal. Martin read it greedily, and then inquired, "Now where upon the plan may this place be?" "Upon the plan?" said Scatter. "Yes." He turned towards it, and reflected for a short time, as if, having been put upon his mettle, he was resolved to be particular to the very minutest hair's breadth of a shade. At length, after wheeling his toothpick slowly round and round in the air, as if it were a carrier pigeon just thrown up, he suddenly made a dart at the drawing, and pierced the very centre of the main wharf through and through. "There," he said, leaving his knife quivering in the wall. "That's where it is." Martin glanced with sparkling eyes upon his co., and his co. saw that the thing was done. The bargain was not concluded as easily as might have been expected, though, for Scatter was caustic and ill-humored, and cast much unnecessary opposition in the way, at one time requesting them to think of it and call again in a week or a fortnight, at another predicting that they wouldn't like it, at another offering to retract and let them off, and muttering strong imprecations upon the folly of the General. But the whole of the astoundingly small sum total of purchase money, it was only $150, or something more than £30 of the capital brought by Co. into the architectural concern, was ultimately paid down, and Martin's head was 2 inches nearer the roof of the little wooden office, with the consciousness of being a landed proprietor in the thriving city of Eden. "If it shouldn't happen to fit," said Scatter, as he gave Martin the necessary credentials on receipt of his money, "don't blame me." "No, no," he replied merrily, "we'll not blame you. General, are you going?" "I am at your service, sir, and I wish you," said the General, giving him his hand with grave cordiality, "joy of your possession. You air now, sir, a denizen of the most powerful and highly civilized dominion that has ever graced the world, a dominion, sir, where man is bound to man in one vast bond of equal love and truth. May you, sir, be worthy of your adopted country." Martin thanked him, and took leave of Mr. Scatter, who had resumed his post in the rocking chair immediately on the General's rising from it, and was once more swinging away as if he had never been disturbed. Mark looked back several times as they went down the road towards the National Hotel, but now his blighted profile was towards them, and nothing but attentive thoughtfulness was written on it. Strangely different to the other side. He was not a man much given to laughing, and never laughed outright, but every line in the print of the crow's foot, and every little wiry vein in that division of his head, was wrinkled up into a grin. The compound figure of Death and the lady at the top of the old ballad was not divided with a greater nicety, and hadn't halves more monstrously unlike each other than the two profiles of Zephaniah Scatter. The General posted along at a great rate, for the clock was on the stroke of 12, and at that hour precisely the great meeting of the Watertoast sympathizers was to be holden in the public room of the National Hotel. Being very curious to witness the demonstration and know what it was all about, Martin kept close to the General, and keeping closer than ever when they entered the hall, got by that means upon a little platform of tables at the upper end, where an armchair was set for the General, and Mr. Lafayette Kettle, as secretary, was making a great display of some foolscap documents, screamers, no doubt. "Well, sir," he said, as he shook hands with Martin, "here is a spectacle calculated to make the British Lion put his tail between his legs and howl with anguish, I expect." Martin certainly thought it possible that the British Lion might have been rather out of his element in that ark, but he kept the idea to himself. The General was then voted to the chair on the motion of a pallid lad of the Jefferson Brick School, who forthwith set in for a high-spiced speech with a good deal about hearths and homes in it, and unriveting the chains of tyranny. Oh, but it was a clincher for the British Lion, it was. The indignation of the glowing young Columbian knew no bounds. If he could only have been one of his own forefathers, he said, wouldn't he have peppered that same lion, and been to him as another brute tamer with a wire whip, teaching him lessons not easily forgotten? "Lion!" cried that young Columbian. "Where is he? Who is he? What is he? Show him to me. Let me have him here. Here," said the young Columbian in a wrestling attitude, "upon this sacred altar. Here," cried the young Columbian, idealizing the dining table, "upon ancestral ashes cemented with the glorious blood poured out like water on our native plains of Chickabiddy Lick. Bring forth that lion," said the young Columbian. "Alone I dare him. I taunt that lion. I tell that lion that Freedom's hand once twisted in his mane, he rolls a course before me, and the eagles of the great republic laugh. Ha ha!" When it was found that the lion didn't come, but kept out of the way, that the young Columbian stood there with folded arms, alone in his glory, and consequently that the eagles were no doubt laughing wildly on the mountain tops, such cheers arose as might have shaken the hands upon the Horse Guards clock, and changed the very mean time of the day in England's capital. "Who is this?" Martin telegraphed to Lafayette. The secretary wrote something very gravely on a piece of paper, twisted it up, and had it passed to him from hand to hand. It was an improvement on the old sentiment, "Perhaps as remarkable a man as any in our country." This young Columbian was succeeded by another, to the full as eloquent as he, who drew down storms of cheers; but both remarkable youths, in their great excitement, for your true poetry can never stoop to details, forgot to say with whom or what the water toasters sympathized, and likewise why or wherefore they were sympathetic. Thus Martin remained for a long time as completely in the dark as ever, until at length a ray of light broke in upon him through the medium of the secretary, who, by reading the minutes of their past proceedings, made the matter somewhat clearer. He then learned that the Water Toast Association sympathized with a certain public man in Ireland who held a contest upon certain points with England, and that they did so because they didn't love England at all, not by any means because they loved Ireland much, being indeed horribly jealous and distrustful of its people always, and only tolerating them because of their working hard, which made them very useful, labor being held in greater indignity in the simple republic than in any other country upon earth. This rendered Martin curious to see what grounds of sympathy the Water Toast Association put forth, nor was he long in suspense, for the general rose to read a letter to the public man, which with his own hands he had written. "Thus," said the general, "thus, my friends and fellow citizens, it runs: Sir, I address you on behalf of the Water Toast Association of United Sympathizers. It is founded, sir, in the great Republic of America, and now holds its breath and swells the blue veins in its forehead nigh to bursting as it watches, sir, with feverish intensity and sympathetic ardor, your noble efforts in the cause of freedom." At the name of freedom, and at every repetition of that name, all the sympathizers roared aloud, cheering with 9 times 9 and 9 times over. "In freedom's name, sir, holy freedom, I address you. In freedom's name I send herewith a contribution to the funds of your society. In freedom's name, sir, I advert with indignation and disgust to that accursed animal with gore-stained whiskers, whose rampant cruelty and fiery lust have ever been a scourge, a torment to the world. The naked visitors to Crusoe's Island, sir, the flying wives of Peter Wilkins, the fruit-smeared children of the tangled bush, nay, even the men of large stature anciently bred in the mining districts of Cornwall, alike bear witness to its savage nature. Where, sir, are the cormorants, the blunderbores, the great fee-fo-fums named in history? All exterminated by its destroying hand. I allude, sir, to the British Lion. Devoted mind and body, heart and soul to freedom, sir, to freedom, blessed solace to the snail upon the cellar door, the oyster in his pearly bed, the still mite in his home of cheese, the very winkle of your country in his shelly lair, in her unsullied name we offer you our sympathy. O sir, in this our cherished and our happy land, her fires burn bright and clear and smokeless. Once lighted up in yours, the lions shall be roasted whole. I am, sir, in freedom's name, your affectionate friend and faithful sympathizer, Cyrus Choke, General, U.S.M. It happened that just as the general began to read this letter, the railroad train arrived, bringing a new mail from England, and a packet had been handed in to the secretary, which, during its perusal and the frequent cheerings in homage to freedom, he had opened. Now its contents disturbed him very much, and the moment the general sat down he hurried to his side and placed in his hand a letter and several printed extracts from English newspapers, to which, in a state of infinite excitement, he called his immediate attention. The general, being greatly heated by his own composition, was in a fit state to receive any inflammable influence. But he had no sooner possessed himself of the contents of these documents than a change came over his face, involving such a huge amount of choler and passion that the noisy concourse were silent in a moment, in very wonder at the sight of him. "My friends," cried the general, rising, "my friends and fellow citizens, we have been mistaken in this man." "In what man?" was the cry. "In this," panted the general, holding up the letter he had read aloud a few minutes before. "I find that he has been and is the advocate, consistent in it always too, of nigger emancipation. If anything beneath the sky be real, those sons of freedom would have pistolled, stabbed, in some way slain, that man by coward hands and murderous violence, if he had stood among them at that time. The most confiding of their own countrymen would not have wagered then, no, nor would they ever peril, one dunghill straw upon the life of any man in such a strait. They tore the letter, cast the fragments in the air, trod down the pieces as they fell, and yelled and groaned and hissed till they could cry no longer. I shall move," said the general, when he could make himself heard, "that the Watertoast Association of United Sympathizers be immediately dissolved." "Down with it, away with it, don't hear of it, burn its records, pull the room down, blot it out of human memory." "But my fellow countrymen," said the general, "the contributions. We have funds. What is to be done with the funds?" It was hastily resolved that a piece of plate should be presented to a certain constitutional judge who had laid down from the bench the noble principle that it was lawful for any white mob to murder any black man, and that another piece of plate of similar value should be presented to a certain patriot who had declared from his high place in the legislature that he and his friends would hang without trial any abolitionist who might pay them a visit. For the surplus it was agreed that it should be devoted to aiding the enforcement of those free and equal laws which render it incalculably more criminal and dangerous to teach a negro to read and write than to roast him alive in a public city. These points adjusted, the meeting broke up in great disorder, and there was an end of the Watertoast sympathy. As Martin ascended to his bedroom, his eye was attracted by the Republican banner which had been hoisted from the housetop in honor of the occasion, and was fluttering before a window which he passed. "Tut!" said Martin, "you're a gay flag in the distance, but let a man be near enough to get the light upon the other side and see through you, and you are but sorry fustian." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 22, from which it will be seen that Martin became a lion of his own account, together with the reason why. As soon as it was generally known in the National Hotel that the young Englishman, Mr. Chuzzlewit, had purchased a location in the Valley of Eden and intended to betake himself to that earthly paradise by the next steamboat, he became a popular character. Why this should be, or how it had come to pass, Martin no more knew than Mrs. Gamp of Kingsgate Street, High Holborn, did. but that he was for the time being the lion, by popular election, of the Watertoast community, and that his society was in rather inconvenient request, there could be no kind of doubt. The first notification he received of this change in his position was the following epistle, written in a thin running hand, with here and there a fat letter or two, to make the general effect more striking, on a sheet of paper ruled with blue lines. National Hotel, Monday morning. Dear Sir, when I had the privilege of being your fellow traveller in the cars the day before yesterday, you offered some remarks upon the subject of the Tower of London, which, in common with my fellow citizens generally, I could wish to hear repeated to a public audience. As Secretary to the Young Men's Watertoast Association of this town, I am requested to inform you that the Society will be proud to hear you deliver a lecture upon the Tower of London at their hall tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, and as a large issue of $quarter tickets may be expected, your answer and consent by bearer will be considered obliging. Dear Sir, yours truly, Lafayette Kettle, the Honorable M. Chuzzlewit. P.S. The Society would not be particular in limiting you to the Tower of London. Permit me to suggest that any remarks upon the elements of geology, or, if more convenient, upon the writings of your talented and witty countryman, the Honourable Mr. Miller, would be well received. Very much aghast at this invitation, Martin wrote back, civilly declining it, and had scarcely done so when he received another letter. Number 47, Bunker Hill Street, Monday morning. Private. Sir, I was raised in those interminable solitudes where our mighty Mississippi, or Father of Waters, rolls his turbid flood. I am young and ardent, for there is a poetry in wildness, and every alligator basking in the slime is in himself an epic, self-contained.
I aspirate for fame. It is my yearning and my thirst.
Are you, sir, aware of any member of Congress in England who would undertake to pay my expenses to that country, and for 6 months after my arrival? There is something within me which gives me the assurance that this enlightened patronage would not be thrown away. In literature or art, the bar, the pulpit, or the stage, in one or other, if not all, I feel that I am certain to succeed. If too much engaged to write to any such yourself, please let me have a list of 3 or 4 of those most likely to respond, and I will address them through the post office. May I also ask you to favor me with any critical observations that have ever presented themselves to your reflective faculties on Cain, a Mystery, by the Right Honourable Lord Byron? I am, sir, yours, forgive me if I add soaringly, Putnam Smith. P.S. Address your answer to America Junior, Messrs. Hancock and Floby, Dry Goods Store, as above. Both of which letters, together with Martin's reply to each, were, according to a laudable custom, much tending to the promotion of gentlemanly feeling and social confidence, published in the next number of the Watertoast Gazette. He had scarcely got through this correspondence when Captain Kedgick, the landlord, kindly came upstairs to see how he was getting on. The captain sat down upon the bed before he spoke, and finding it rather hard, moved to the pillow. "Well, sir," said the captain, putting his hat a little more on one side, for it was rather tight in the crown, "you're quite a public man, I calc'late." "So it seems," retorted Martin, who was very tired. "Our citizens, sir," pursued the captain, "intend to pay their respects to you. You will have to hold a sort of levee, sir, while you're here." "Powers above!" cried Martin. "I couldn't do that, my good fellow." "I reckon you must, then," said the captain. "Must is not a pleasant word, Captain," urged Martin. "Well, I didn't fix the mother language, and I can't unfix it," said the captain coolly, "else I'd make it pleasant. You must receive, that's all." "But why should I receive people who care as much for me as I care for them?" asked Martin. "Well, because I have had a monument put up in the bar," returned the captain. "A what?" cried Martin. "A monument," rejoined the captain. Martin looked despairingly at Mark, who informed him that the captain meant a written notice that Mr. Chuzzlewit would receive the Watertoasters that day, at and after 2 o'clock, which was in effect then hanging in the bar, as Mark, from ocular inspection of the same, could testify. "You wouldn't be unpop'lar, I know," said the captain, paring his nails. "Our citizens ain't long of riling up, I tell you, and our Gazette could flay you like a wild cat." Martin was going to be very wroth, but he thought better of it, and said, "In heaven's name, let them come, then." "Oh, they'll come," returned the captain. "I have seen the big room fixed to purpose with my eyes." "But will you," said Martin, seeing that the captain was about to go, "will you at least tell me this? What do they want to see me for? What have I done? And how do they happen to have such a sudden interest in me?" Captain Kedgick put a thumb and 3 fingers to each side of the brim of his hat, lifted it a little way off his head, put it on again carefully, passed one hand all down his face, beginning at the forehead and ending at the chin, looked at Martin, then at Mark, then at Martin again, winked, and walked out. "Upon my life, now," said Martin, bringing his hand heavily upon the table, "such a perfectly unaccountable fellow as that I never saw. Mark, what do you say to this?" "Why, sir," returned his partner, "my opinion is that we must have got to the most remarkable man in the country at last. So I hope there's an end to the breed, sir." Although this made Martin laugh, it couldn't keep off 2 o'clock. Punctually as the hour struck, Captain Kedgick returned to hand him to the room of state, and he had no sooner got him safe there than he bawled down the staircase to his fellow citizens below that Mr. Chuzzlewit was receiving. Up they came with a rush. Up they came until the room was full, and through the open door a dismal perspective of more to come was shown upon the stairs. One after another, dozen after dozen, score after score, more, up they came, all shaking hands with Martin. Such varieties of hands! The thick, the thin, the short, the long, the fat, the lean, the coarse, the fine. Such differences of temperature, the hot, the cold, the dry, the moist, the flabby. Such diversities of grasp, the tight, the loose, the short-lived, and the lingering. Still up, more, and ever and anon the captain's voice was heard above the crowd. "There's more below, there's more below. Now, gentlemen, you that have been introduced to Mr. Chuzzlewit, will you clear, gentlemen, will you clear? Will you be so good as clear, gentlemen, and make a little room for more?" Regardless of the captain's cries, they didn't clear at all, but stood there bolt upright and staring. 2 gentlemen connected with the Watertoast Gazette had come express to get the matter for an article on Martin. They had agreed to divide the labor. One of them took him below the waistcoat, one above. Each stood directly in front of his subject, with his head a little on one side, intent on his department. If Martin put one boot before the other, the lower gentleman was down upon him. He rubbed a pimple on his nose, and the upper gentleman booked it. He opened his mouth to speak, and the same gentleman was on one knee before him, looking in at his teeth, with the nice scrutiny of a dentist. Amateurs in the physiognomical and phrenological sciences roved about him with watchful eyes and itching fingers, and sometimes one, more daring than the rest, made a mad grasp at the back of his head and vanished in the crowd. They had him in all points of view, in front, in profile, 3/4 face, and behind. Those who were not professional or scientific audibly exchanged opinions on his looks. New lights shone in upon him in respect of his nose. Contradictory rumors were abroad on the subject of his hair. And still the captain's voice was heard, so stifled by the concourse that he seemed to speak from underneath a feather bed, exclaiming, "Gentlemen, you that have been introduced to Mr. Chuzzlewit, will you clear?" Even when they began to clear it was no better, for then a stream of gentlemen, every one with a lady on each arm, exactly like the chorus to the national anthem when royalty goes in state to the play, came gliding in, every new group fresher than the last, and bent on staying to the latest moment. If they spoke to him, which was not often, they invariably asked the same questions in the same tone, with no more remorse or delicacy or consideration than if he had been a figure of stone, purchased and paid for, and set up there for their delight. Even when, in the slow course of time, these died off, it was as bad as ever, if not worse. For then the boys grew bold and came in as a class of themselves, and did everything that the grown-up people had done. Uncouth stragglers, too, appeared, men of a ghostly kind who, being in, didn't know how to get out again, insomuch that one silent gentleman, with glazed and fishy eyes, and only one button on his waistcoat, which was a very large metal one and shone prodigiously, got behind the door and stood there like a clock long after everybody else was gone. Martin felt, from pure fatigue and heat and worry, as if he could have fallen on the ground and willingly remained there, if they would but have had the mercy to leave him alone. But as letters and messages threatening his public denouncement if he didn't see the senders poured in like hail, and as more visitors came while he took his coffee by himself, and as Mark, with all his vigilance, was unable to keep them from the door, he resolved to go to bed. Not that he felt at all sure of bed being any protection, but that he might not leave a forlorn hope untried. He had communicated this design to Mark, and was on the eve of escaping, when the door was thrown open in a great hurry, and an elderly gentleman entered, bringing with him a lady who certainly could not be considered young. That was matter of fact, and probably could not be considered handsome, but that was matter of opinion. She was very straight, very tall, and not at all flexible in face or figure. On her head she wore a great straw bonnet with trimmings of the same, in which she looked as if she had been thatched by an unskilful labourer, and in her hand she held a most enormous fan. "Mr. Chuzzlewit, I believe?" said the gentleman. "That is my name." "Sir," said the gentleman, "I am pressed for time." "Thank God," thought Martin. "I go back to my home, sir," pursued the gentleman, "by the return train, which starts immediate. Start is not a word you use in your country, sir." "Oh, yes, it is," said Martin. "You air mistaken, sir," returned the gentleman with great decision. "But we will not pursue the subject, lest it should awake your prejudice. Sir, Mrs. Hominy." Martin bowed. "Mrs. Hominy, sir, is the lady of Major Hominy, one of our choicest spirits, and belongs to one of our most aristocratic families. You air, p'raps, acquainted, sir, with Mrs. Hominy's writings?" Martin couldn't say he was. "You have much to learn and to enjoy, sir," said the gentleman. "Mrs. Hominy is going to stay until the end of the fall, sir, with her married daughter at the settlement of New Thermopylae, 3 days this side of Eden. Any attention, sir, that you can show to Mrs. Hominy upon the journey will be very grateful, to the Major and our fellow citizens. Mrs. Hominy, I wish you good night, ma'am, and a pleasant progress on your route." Martin could scarcely believe it, but he had gone, and Mrs. Hominy was drinking the milk. "A'most used up, I am, I do declare," she observed. "The jolting in the cars is pretty nigh as bad as if the rail was full of snags and sawyers." "Snags and sawyers, ma'am?" said Martin. "Well, then, I do suppose you'll hardly realize my meaning, sir," said Mrs. Hominy. "My, only think, do tell." It did not appear that these expressions, although they seemed to conclude with an urgent entreaty, stood in need of any answer, for Mrs. Hominy, untying her bonnet strings, observed that she would withdraw to lay that article of dress aside, and would return immediately. "Mark," said Martin, "touch me, will you? Am I awake?" "Hominy is, sir," returned his partner, "broad awake. Just the sort of woman, sir, as would be discovered with her eyes wide open, and her mind a working for her country's good, at any hour of the day or night." They had no opportunity of saying more, for Mrs. Hominy stalked in again, very erect, in proof of her aristocratic blood, and holding in her clasped hands a red cotton pocket handkerchief, perhaps a parting gift from that choice spirit, the Major. She had laid aside her bonnet, and now appeared in a highly aristocratic and classical cap, meeting beneath her chin, a style of headdress so admirably adapted to her countenance that if the late Mr. Grimaldi had appeared in the lappets of Mrs. Siddons, a more complete effect could not have been produced. Martin handed her to a chair. Her first words arrested him before he could get back to his own seat. "Pray, sir," said Mrs. Hominy, "where do you hail from?" "I am afraid I am dull of comprehension," answered Martin, "being extremely tired, but upon my word I don't understand you." Mrs. Hominy shook her head with a melancholy smile that said, not inexpressively, "They corrupt even the language in that old country," and added then, as coming down a step or two to meet his low capacity, "Where was you rose?" "Oh," said Martin, "I was born in Kent." "And how do you like our country, sir?" asked Mrs. Hominy. "Very much indeed," said Martin, half asleep. "At least, that is, pretty well, ma'am." "Most strangers, and particularly Britishers, are much surprised by what they see in the United States," remarked Mrs. Hominy. "They have excellent reason to be so, ma'am," said Martin. "I never was so much surprised in all my life." "Our institutions make our people smart much, sir," Mrs. Hominy remarked. "The most short-sighted man could see that at a glance with his naked eye," said Martin. Mrs. Hominy was a philosopher and an authoress, and consequently had a pretty strong digestion. But this coarse, this indecorous phrase was almost too much for her. For a gentleman sitting alone with a lady, although the door was open, to talk about a naked eye! A long interval elapsed before even she, woman of masculine and towering intellect though she was, could call up fortitude enough to resume the conversation. But Mrs. Hominy was a traveller. Mrs. Hominy was a writer of reviews and analytical disquisitions. Mrs. Hominy had had her letters from abroad beginning "My ever dearest blank," and signed "The mother of the modern Gracchi," meaning the married Miss Hominy, regularly printed in a public journal, with all the indignation in capitals, and all the sarcasm in italics. Mrs. Hominy had looked on foreign countries with the eye of a perfect republican hot from the model oven, and Mrs. Hominy could talk or write about them by the hour together. So Mrs. Hominy at last came down on Martin heavily, and as he was fast asleep she had it all her own way and bruised him to her heart's content. It is no great matter what Mrs. Hominy said, save that she had learnt it from the cant of a class, and a large class, of her fellow countrymen, who in their every word avow themselves to be as senseless to the high principles on which America sprang, a nation, into life, as any Orson in her legislative halls, who are no more capable of feeling, or of caring if they did feel, that by reducing their own country to the ebb of honest men's contempt, they put in hazard the rights of nations yet unborn, and very progress of the human race, than are the swine who wallow in their streets, who think that crying out to other nations, old in their iniquity, "We are no worse than you," no worse, is high defence and vantage ground enough for that republic, but yesterday let loose upon her noble course, and but to-day so maimed and lame, so full of sores and ulcers, foul to the eye and almost hopeless to the sense, that her best friends turn from the loathsome creature with disgust, who, having by their ancestors declared and won their independence, because they would not bend the knee to certain public vices and corruptions, and would not abrogate the truth, run riot in the bad, and turn their backs upon the good, and lying down contented with the wretched boast that other temples also are of glass, and stones which batter theirs may be flung back, show themselves, and that alone, as immeasurably behind the import of the trust they hold, and as unworthy to possess it, as if the sordid hucksterings of all their little governments, each one a kingdom in its small depravity, were brought into a heap for evidence against them. Martin by degrees became so far awake that he had a sense of a terrible oppression on his mind, an imperfect dream that he had murdered a particular friend and couldn't get rid of the body. When his eyes opened, it was staring him full in the face. There was the horrible Hominy, talking deep truths in a melodious snuffle, and pouring forth her mental endowments to such an extent that the Major's bitterest enemy, hearing her, would have forgiven him from the bottom of his heart. Martin might have done something desperate if the gong had not sounded for supper. But sound it did, most opportunely, and having stationed Mrs. Hominy at the upper end of the table, he took refuge at the lower end himself, whence, after a hasty meal, he stole away, while the lady was yet busied with dried beef and a saucer full of pickled fixings. It would be difficult to give an adequate idea of Mrs. Hominy's freshness next day, or of the avidity with which she went headlong into moral philosophy at breakfast. Some little additional degree of asperity, perhaps, was visible in her features, but not more than the pickles would have naturally produced. All that day she clung to Martin. She sat beside him while he received his friends, for there was another reception, yet more numerous than the former, propounded theories and answered imaginary objections, so that Martin really began to think he must be dreaming and speaking for two. She quoted interminable passages from certain essays on government, written by herself, used the Major's pocket-handkerchief as if the snuffle were a temporary malady of which she was determined to rid herself by some means or other, and in short was such a remarkable companion that Martin quite settled it between himself and his conscience that in any new settlement it would be absolutely necessary to have such a person knocked on the head for the general peace of society. In the meantime Mark was busy from early in the morning until late at night in getting on board the steamboat such provisions, tools, and other necessaries as they had been forewarned it would be wise to take. The purchase of these things and the settlement of their bill at the National reduced their finances to so low an ebb that if the captain had delayed his departure any longer they would have been in almost as bad a plight as the unfortunate poorer immigrants who, seduced on board by solemn advertisement, had been living on the lower deck a whole week, and exhausting their miserable stock of provisions before the voyage commenced. There they were, all huddled together with the engine and the fires, farmers who had never seen a plough, woodmen who had never used an axe, builders who couldn't make a box, cast out of their own land, with not a hand to aid them, newly come into an unknown world, children in helplessness, but men in wants, with younger children at their backs, to live or die as it might happen. The morning came, and they would start at noon. Noon came, and they would start at night. But nothing is eternal in this world, not even the procrastination of an American skipper, and at night all was ready. Dispirited and weary to the last degree, but a greater lion than ever, he had done nothing all the afternoon but answer letters from strangers, half of them about nothing, half about borrowing money, and all requiring an instantaneous reply. Martin walked down to the wharf through a concourse of people, with Mrs. Hominy upon his arm, and went on board. But Mark was bent on solving the riddle of this lionship if he could, and so, not without the risk of being left behind, ran back to the hotel. Captain Kedgick was sitting in the colonnade with a julep on his knee and a cigar in his mouth. He caught Mark's eye and said, "Why, what the tarnal brings you here?" "I'll tell you plainly what it is, Captain," said Mark. "I want to ask you a question." "A man may ask a question, so he may," returned Kedgick, strongly implying that another man might not answer a question, so he mightn't. "What have they been making so much of him for now?" said Mark, slyly. "Come." "Our people like excitement," answered Kedgick, sucking his cigar. "But how has he excited 'em?" asked Mark. The captain looked at him as if he were half inclined to unburden his mind of a capital joke. "You air going?" he said. "Going?" cried Mark. "Ain't every moment precious?" "Our people like excitement," said the captain, whispering. "He ain't like emigrants in gineral. And he excited 'em along of this." He winked and burst into a smothered laugh. "Along of this. Scatter is a smart man, and nobody as goes to Eden ever comes back alive." The wharf was close at hand, and at that instant Mark could hear them shouting out his name, could even hear Martin calling to him to make haste or they would be separated. It was too late to mend the matter, or put any face upon it but the best. He gave the captain a parting benediction and ran off like a racehorse. "Mark! Mark!" cried Martin. "Here am I, sir," shouted Mark, suddenly replying from the edge of the quay and leaping at a bound on board. "Never was half so jolly, sir. All right, haul in. Go ahead." The sparks from the wood fire streamed upward from the two chimneys, as if the vessel were a great firework just lighted, and they roared away upon the dark water. End of chapter 22.